whispering like that? Well,
you want to play rough? We can play rough.
Let's get
so
The antagonist is one of the most intriguing concepts in storytelling. The capabilities when it comes to their narrative throughline are boundless. The protagonist, theoretically, has infinite narrative direction as well. However, in popular media, that is rarely the case. They can fail, and their ideological standpoint can be questioned or outright disowned. However, this rarely ever affects how the audience perceives them. The modern protagonist can only succeed or fail upwards. That doesn't mean that by the end, the narrative portrays them as lovable, but more often than not, that's how the viewer sees them. The antagonist, in this regard, is different, since the plot only dictates that the antagonist is thwarted by the end. In these circumstances, the writer can allow the viewer to see the antagonist in any light. This also extends to their actions. Just because they were defeated doesn't mean that they have lost. The antagonist can be and say anything, and I find that to be such a shame, because the handling of their ideology, whether that be by the writer or the audience, causes a muffling in their message. Let me elaborate. My feelings on antagonists are hard to explain. That's why I will use an analogy to express those feelings to the best of my abilities. In my worldview, every villain can be broken down and dissected with three concepts: the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. The thesis is, at its core, an idea or way of thinking that an individual or collective possess. The antithesis is the opposite of the thesis, in whatever form that may take. And finally, there's the synthesis, which is the combination of both ideas that create a brand new theory or way of thinking, essentially making it the fusion of both. I believe that the villain's narrative presence is ingrained in these three concepts. When applied to storytelling, the thesis represents the status quo, or the ideology found within the world and the protagonist. The antithesis is the ideology found within the antagonist and everyone that follows them, which of course goes against the thesis. The synthesis is the desired resolution to both point of views for the antagonist. From what we understand, this would result in the obliteration of the thesis. The antagonist's thesis usually never happens, and when they are defeated, it is quickly discarded in place for the thesis of the protagonist, which is either no change to the thesis or an evolution of it. The status quo stays, but it is tweaked a bit. My concern is, once the antagonist's synthesis is discarded, so is their antithesis by consequence. However, I believe that the antithesis can be at times a valid point of view in the current state of the world. I am assuming you will need some examples. Some stand out for their level of quality. Notably, the MCU Spider-Man possesses some very interesting villains. In the movie Spider-Man Homecoming, the Vulture, or Adrian Toomes, is a man who is victim to a system that has abandoned him. He is now forced to salvage money for his family, while others live in immeasurable wealth with money they didn't earn. In Spider-Man Far From Home, Mysterio, or Quentin Beck, is right. The MCU has come to a point where an apocalyptic event can occur on a yearly basis, and the man who was at the forefront of defending humanity trusted the safety of the world to a teenager, when they really should be in the hands of the most capable and qualified people. These motivations are used as the antithesis for both antagonists, and even by the end of both movies, they still stand as valid complaints. Their frustration escalated to a point where they truly believed that theft and violence were their only options. which forces Spider-Man to interfere. By the end of both movies, Spider-Man defeats both of them and learns a lesson that has nothing to do with their antithesis. This unintentionally makes Spider-Man a little villainous, because he can make sure that another Vulture or Mysterio never happens again by defeating the problem in the stem, but instead stays oblivious to their problems. However, there are good examples of synthesis within Marvel movies. Case in point, Black Panther. Killmonger's criticism against the ruling powers of Wakanda are valid. Their resources could potentially help millions of people, especially the other Africans on their continent and all around the world. But since they won't, he takes matters into his own hands. Now don't get me wrong, his solution of starting a war was objectively wrong. However, the motive for his actions still held some value. And after his defeat, that value still resonated with T'Challa. By the end of the film, T'Challa decides to open up Wakanda's resources to other nations, making it one of the rare examples of where an antagonist's antithesis actually comes to fruition. The large majority of MCU villains are human or somewhat humanoid. However, another interesting take on antagonists is when their character and their motivations are somewhat less than. Shadow of the Colossus is one of the most unique experiences in gaming. The conversations that could be had on the world building and the motifs alone are boundless. And the burning core of what makes this game so interesting are the Colossi and their portrayal as antagonists. There is this clear distinction that Colossi are antagonists and not villains, since a villain by definition is a character that conducts evil actions or motives in the plot. An antagonist, meanwhile, is a character who simply opposes the protagonist. But that does not inherently mean that they are actively trying to stop him. The Colossi clearly follow the model of the latter. When you first encounter them, a large majority of the Colossi mean the protagonist no harm. And even those who do, arguably, are just defending their land from an unknown invader. It is actually the hero who sets out to kill these creatures who have done nothing wrong. The Colossi hold no antithesis. And that's why, in my opinion, they are such great antagonists, because they aren't. You are. Now I do realize that the protagonist had his reasons for killing them. He was trying to save the life of a young girl. But what I am saying is, was it the right moral choice to kill 16 of these intelligent creatures to save one person? I would argue that this game explores the selfishness of heroes doing good as long as it aligns with their interest, and the dark depths that someone is willing to go as long as they think they're doing the moral thing. So far, we have explored human and monster antagonists. But what about enemies that are not completely human and not completely monster either? Game of Thrones, among other things, has a lot of amazing villains who each escalate throughout the seasons. There's Joffrey, Ramsay, and Cersei, just to name a few. Following that logic, what should have been the penultimate villains are the White Walkers, or the Others. A lot of people wish that the White Walkers and the Night King had a motivation. Even though I would have liked that, I think them being a force of nature, in this context, works just as well or even better. George R.R. Martin, the author of the Game of Thrones series, has said that the White Walkers are a metaphor for climate change. In the books, there is no Night King, and with no other visible leader, this really hammers home the idea that they're a force of nature. As a metaphor for climate change, it creates a very clear-cut parallel with our world. The leaders of Westeros are way too busy bickering with each other over power to deal with the ice zombies that are coming to kill them. In these types of situations, it's hard not to reflect on ourselves. Like I said earlier, the White Walkers have no internal drive or motivation for their actions. However, there is an antithesis to be found in this series. It doesn't derive from the White Walkers, but from what the White Walkers make us realize about ourselves. The realization that all this death and suffering could have easily been prevented if the leaders of the world were more unified. But the saddest portion is the realization that it took the apocalypse for humanity to put aside their differences and work together. The White Walkers are a brilliant antagonistic force because their mere existence shines a light on humanity's worst traits. The ending for the books hasn't been written yet. However, an ideal synthesis would be the unity of mankind in the future, and making the lords and ladies of Westeros learn a lesson in compromise. It is a shame that Season 8 defeated them in only one episode, only to return to pointless politics for the series finale. I do plan on making a video on the failures of the TV show, and to explore the writing in more detail. But for now, I'll leave it there. Whether it be antagonists or villains, the impact that they have over the narrative is immense. However, it could be more. Lessons and philosophies could be a learning experience. Not to say you should idealize every villain, however, there should be a clear distinction between their philosophies and their actions. It is only by studying their philosophy